People do not reject the resurrection because there is no evidence. They reject it because if it is true, it changes everything. The influence of modern thought, from the Enlightenment until today, asserts a clear premise. Nature has fixed laws. The dead do not rise. Therefore, any account of resurrection is impossible. But this conclusion starts from an assumption that God would be limited by the laws He Himself created. Jesus Christ is not merely a man. He is God. The Creator is not limited by His creation. Just as a programmer is not limited by the robot he has built, God is not limited by the universe He brought into existence. We cannot conceive eternity because we are conditioned by time. But to reject the existence of a Creator simply because we cannot fully understand Him is, in itself, a contradiction. We accept the hypothesis that the universe appeared from nothing. Why would it be harder to accept the existence of a Creator? We accept that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. We accept that Socrates existed, based on relatively few and relatively late manuscripts. But when it comes to the resurrection, the standard suddenly becomes impossible. Laboratory evidence is demanded, but history does not work that way. The resurrection is the foundation of Christianity. If Christ has not risen, faith is in vain. That is why the reaction against the resurrection is not only intellectual, but often emotional. The resurrection implies divine authority, judgment, and moral responsibility, and these implications provoke a deep reaction. A central example is Paul, formerly known as Saul of Tarsus. He had been a fervent persecutor of Christians. His transformation was not superficial, but radical. How can it be explained that a persecuting Pharisee becomes one of the most influential apostles, author of a large part of the New Testament, and is willing to suffer and die for his message if he knew it was false? In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 14 and 15, Paul states, "If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless." And he continues, "And we are found to be false witnesses about God." The important observation is this: the apostles do not develop extended arguments about the resurrection in their epistles. This suggests that the resurrection was already considered an accepted fact in the early Christian communities, not a new idea that needed to be demonstrated from the beginning. Christianity spread rapidly, despite severe persecution. The apostles died for this testimony. People may die for something they believe is true, but would they die for something they knew was false? Even though Paul and Peter had a public dispute, as we read in Galatians chapter 2, verse 11, this concerned practical matters. In essence, they were united. The proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as also seen in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 5 through 11. James and John speak about the second coming of Jesus, an event that necessarily presupposes that he has risen. In Acts chapter 17, verse 32, the Athenians mock Paul when they hear about the resurrection. Their reaction shows that the message was presented clearly and directly. The question remains: how did the Greeks and the other nations come to accept Christianity if the apostles had no convincing arguments? The chief priests and the Pharisees sent Judas together with a detachment of soldiers and temple guards, with torches and weapons. Jesus was arrested at night. He was hurriedly tried by the Sanhedrin and finally brought before Pilate at daybreak. When asked what accusation they brought against him, the accusers answered, If he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate told them to judge him according to their own law. But they replied that, according to their law, they were not permitted to execute anyone. After questioning Jesus personally, Pilate came out before the Jews and declared that he found no guilt in him. Because there was a custom at Passover to release one prisoner, he offered to release Jesus. But they chose Barabbas, a murderer. Pilate repeated that he found no guilt in him and sought to release him. But the Jews threatened him. If he released Jesus, he would oppose Caesar, because Jesus claimed to be a king. Fearing this, Pilate condemned him to crucifixion. Jesus was scourged and mocked until he was hardly recognizable. He was forced to carry his own cross, thirsty and exhausted. Instead of water, they gave him a sponge soaked in vinegar. The execution was public, near the walls of Jerusalem and close to a busy road, alongside two revolutionary activists. The soldiers cast lots for his garments. The purpose of this execution was humiliation and a warning to others. These events were not accidental. Psalm 22 had foretold them 1,000 years earlier, and the prophet Isaiah wrote more than 700 years before about the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus, beginning with chapter 52, verse 13, through the end of chapter 53, also known as the Forbidden Chapter in Jewish religion. The body of Jesus was taken down from the cross at the request of Joseph of Arimathea, a discreet disciple of Jesus, a member of the Jerusalem elite and of the Supreme Council. He buried him in his own new tomb, cut into rock. Some claimed that the disciples had taken the body, but Matthew, in chapter 28, states that the temple authorities bribed the soldiers to spread this version. The reality is simple. Neither the Romans nor the Jews had anything to gain from moving the body. A body in the tomb means a confirmed death. And without an empty tomb, no hope would have survived. Moreover, the disciples believed, according to the writings of the prophets of the Old Testament, in a universal resurrection at the end of history. They did not expect Jesus to die. This is clearly seen in the request of James and John to occupy positions of power when Jesus would enter into his glory. Jesus rose and appeared multiple times. According to the testimony of Paul, he appeared to Peter, to the 12 apostles, to James, to Paul himself, and to more than 500 brothers, most of whom were still alive at the time the letter to the Corinthians was written. Paul does not develop a long argument. He does not construct a sophisticated defense, because in that context, the resurrection was already known, and the witnesses could be consulted. John, the author of the fourth gospel, states that he saw the risen Christ. He declares that he saw him die, that he went to the empty tomb where he observed the linen cloths, and that he encountered the risen Lord. Luke emphasizes the nature of the resurrected body. Jesus eats, speaks, and shows his wounds, but he is no longer limited by the usual conditions of physical existence. Matthew presents the resurrection not as a theory to be proven, but as a reality already accepted. The fact that these testimonies come from distinct and independent traditions strengthens the coherence and consistency of the account. Some say collective hallucination, but hallucinations are individual. They do not occur simultaneously in different places for 40 days. And they do not empty tombs. Alternative explanations become more complicated than the event itself. If Jesus has risen, no one can ignore his authority. His teaching becomes normative. Judgment becomes real. Moral responsibility becomes absolute. The problem is not impossibility, but the discomfort of truth. Rejecting the resurrection is a way to avoid the consequences. A moment will come when you'll have to answer. What will your excuse be?